Chad Daybell was born on August 11th of 1968 and was raised Mormon in the city of Springville, Utah. Following high school, he was accepted into Brigham Young University, but 1 year into his education, he applied to be a missionary, after which he spent 2 years in New Jersey. After returning to BYU, Chad graduated with a bachelor's in journalism and then went on to work as a copy editor for the Ogden-based publication, The Standard Examiner. In 1990, a 22-year-old Chad would marry a girl named Tammy Douglas, and the couple welcomed their first child into the world shortly afterwards. Outwardly, Chad was living the life of a clean-cut Mormon 20-something, but beneath the surface, he began to entertain some deeply unsettling thoughts and hobbies. For instance, while he was still a student at BYU, Chad developed an interest in cemeteries. It started as a part-time job, digging graves in the evenings after his studies were completed. But after a while, it seems Chad started to enjoy the act of digging fresh graves among those already occupied. Even after getting his copy editor's job over at the Standard Examiner, Chad maintained a second full-time appointment as the sexton of Springville Cemetery. He eventually resigned from his position in the late 90s, but only after becoming fixated on a new and very different kind of hobby. In 2001, Chad published One Foot in the Grave, a non-fiction book that chronicled his experiences working in cemeteries. Thanks to a few poignant tracks regarding mourning and mortality, Chad's first serious offering was fairly well received. But then for his second outing, Chad took a radically different direction. He began to write what might be referred to as Mormon end times fiction, stories that depicted apocalyptic situations and dystopian futures. They often featured thinly veiled versions of his friends and family as protagonists, with recurring themes centering around supernatural voices giving instructions to his characters. When asked where he got these ideas from, Chad gave a very interesting response. In the author's note of one of his novels, Chad explained that suffering not one, but 2 near-death experiences in his life had allowed him to see, and I quote, beyond the veil. "I don't fictionalize any of the events portrayed in my books," he writes. "I'm really not that creative. My torn veil allows information to be downloaded into my brain from the other side. The scenes that I am shown are real events that will happen." While his claims were well received among certain sections of his audience, many were turned off by Chad's wild claims and wilder plot lines, and by 2009, his readership began to shrink. Chad began catering more and more to the mostly radical Mormon readership that remained, and to supplement his income, he began giving speeches at LDS events concerned with the second coming of Jesus and other such end-time scenarios. Over time, this led to Chad's religious convictions becoming more and more extreme, and by 2011, he was claiming to have visions regarding the end of days. He claimed to see earthquakes so powerful that California and Oregon would sink into the Pacific, along with wars so destructive they'd engulf entire continents. But it wasn't until 2015 that he claimed to hear the voice of God, and apparently, God was telling him to move to Rexburg, Idaho. But right around the same time Chad was driving Tammy and their 5 children over to Idaho, a woman in Texas was opening up one of his books, and her name was Lori Vallow. Born Lori Noreen Cox in Loma Linda, California on June 26th of 1973, Lori was raised Mormon and by 2015 was married to her 4th husband, Charles Vallow. Having married in 2006, the couple adopted Charles' grandnephew, J.J. Vallow, as the boy's birth parents were unable to care for him, and by all accounts, the marriage was Lori's happiest and most stable to date. But in 2015, when Lori became interested in Chad's Standing in Holy Places series of books, she experienced something of a spiritual reawakening. She became increasingly invested in radical religious beliefs, read dozens of books detailing near-death experiences, and began listening to podcasts hosted by excommunicated Mormons. 3 years later, in October of 2018, Lori attended a Preparing a People event in the state of Utah. One of the speakers was Chad Daybell. Enraptured by his vivid representations of the end times, Lori approached Chad following one of his speeches and reportedly began flirting with him. Chad then told Lori that he believed they'd been married in previous lifetimes, and after exchanging phone numbers, they began a secretive correspondence. Under the guise of maintaining a professional relationship, Chad and Lori made joint appearances on several episodes of the Preparing a People podcast. She claimed to have been captivated by his unique and outspoken beliefs. In reality, the two were conducting a deeply sordid extramarital affair. And over time, a small but deeply fanatical cult formed around Chad and Lori. He christened their organization the Church of the Firstborn, before crowning himself its one and only leader. The group consisted of Lori and her brother Alex Cox, along with Lori's friends Melanie Gibb and Zulema Pastines, the latter of whom ended up married to Lori's brother. All had been raised as deep adherents to the Mormon Church, but on Chad's orders, they relinquished their beliefs with a chilling degree of relish. Despite being rejected by the mainstream Mormon Church, the concept of reincarnation played a huge role in Chad's belief system. He claimed to have lived 31 previous lives, some on distant planets while inhabiting the bodies of advanced species of xenomorph, and one inhabiting the body of Saint James the Less, a figure from early Christianity. Lori, on the other hand, had lived a total of 21 previous lives, 5 of which she'd spent in the company of Chad, and one in which she inhabited the body of Mary French, the great-grandmother of the LDS's founder, Joseph Smith. They were sealed, as Chad phrased it, following their marriages in previous lives, and conveniently, this relationship superseded those of their earthly marriages. When follower Melanie Gibb suggested that Chad and Lori should divorce their spouses, Lori told her that they were not permitted to, due to information they were receiving from, and I quote, the other side of the veil. Yet while Chad and Lori had no problem granting themselves a couple of heavenly hall passes, they were incredibly judgmental when it came to other people. Chad categorized people as either light or dark, depending on whether he associated them with Christ or Satan, but his judgment was far from arbitrary. He and Lori employed a uniquely elaborate scoring system, making people up for virtuous or saintly characteristics and marking them down for morally dubious or outright sinful behavior. Those who scored highly were considered to be reincarnations of famous figures from Christian history, while those on the bottom end of the scale were considered to be possessed by evil spirits. If the group liked you and deemed you worthy of saving, they might perform what they referred to as a casting, a ceremony in which they try to cast away evil spirits through prayers and scripture readings. However, if the demons inside a possessed person were too heavily entrenched and thus impossible to exorcise, Chad and Lori claimed the only possible remedy was death. As you can tell, the passage of time saw Chad and Lori's beliefs become more and more extreme, and eventually, Chad began making apocalyptic proclamations and insisted the end of the world would come on July 22nd of 2020. He told his followers that he was guided by angels and could see hidden truths, while Lori claimed to be an exalted goddess, able to see the future and unconcerned with earthly laws. She became increasingly disinterested with her husband, Charles Vallow, and in February of 2019, she told him that she no longer cared about their marriage or their adopted son, JJ. Lori then loaded up her truck and disappeared for almost 3 whole months. When she finally returned home, she was confronted by her husband, and a vicious argument erupted. During the fight, Lori told Charles that he was possessed by the evil spirit of a man named Ned Schneider, and that this was the root of all the negativity in their marriage. But that's not all. Lori then told Charles that rather than a mere mortal, she was a living deity, assigned to carry out the work of the 144,000 on the occasion of Christ's second coming, which, coincidentally, was only 18 months away. There was much work to be done between that day and the date of Christ's return, and if Charles got in her way, Lori would murder him. The threat to his life prompted Charles to consider divorce, but ultimately, he decided not to give up on her. Lori was quite clearly suffering from severe mental health issues, and as her husband, it's reasonable to believe Charles felt a great deal of responsibility for her. But as the saying goes, no good deed goes unpunished. Right around the same time Charles decided to stick around and work on his marriage, his wife had stopped referring to him by name altogether. In secret text exchanges between Chad and her brother Alex, Lori routinely called her husband Ned, or Hiplos, the latter being the name of the demon thought to have possessed him. Lori told members of her small but fanatical cult that Charles had become a zombie, and that if he couldn't be redeemed through prayer and casting, there would be grave consequences. But before efforts to save his soul have even commenced, Charles Vallow discovered his wife's affair. Somehow, Charles managed to obtain the email address of Tammy Daybell, Chad's long-suffering wife. He drafted a long and heartfelt email informing Tammy of their spouse's infidelities after apologizing for the pain his revelation might cause. Shockingly, after reading through the email, Tammy Daybell simply deleted it and then blocked Charles's email address. Following a huge confrontation regarding the discovery of the affair, Lori left Chad's home to stay in Chandler, Arizona, with little JJ splitting his time between his parents. Then on July 11th of 2019, Charles drove over to Lori's home to pick up JJ, but upon his arrival, he was confronted by none other than Lori's brother, Alex. There was an altercation between the two. Charles retrieved a baseball bat from the trunk of his car. Alex Cox responded by shooting him dead. 16-year-old Tylee Ryan, Lori's daughter from her third husband, later confirmed that Charles did indeed arm himself with a bat, but had run back to the house by the time the shooting commenced and couldn't provide any further insight into the moments before Charles' death. Incredibly, and most likely based on Tylee's testimony, no charges were filed against Alex, and the shooting was deemed to be self-defense. Neighbors reported that later the next day, they witnessed a very loud and very jubilant pool party at Lori's Arizona home. And by August of 2019, Lori had relocated her family to Rexburg, Idaho, in order to be closer to Chad. Upon her arrival, neighbors noticed that little JJ's behavior appeared erratic, and that Lori often left him outside to play alone, without adult supervision and for long periods of time. When confronted about this, Lori neglected to mention that young JJ was autistic, and instead told neighbors that he was, quote, her niece's drug baby. Just weeks later, Lori and her brother Alex took Tylee on a hiking trip to Yellowstone National Park. They walked the trails, ate snacks, but when their trip drew to a close, only Lori and Alex climbed back into her truck. Lori would later tell neighbors that Tylee had been accepted into Brigham Young University on some kind of early scholarship program for gifted high schoolers. In reality, no one would ever see Tylee again. A few weeks after the Yellowstone trip, on September 22nd of 2019, Melanie Gibb and her boyfriend, David Warwick, were staying at Lori's home. And in the evening, Warwick saw Alex Cox taking a sleeping JJ upstairs to his bedroom, and this marked the last time anyone would see the boy alive. A few days later, Lori informed Rexburg Elementary School that she would now be homeschooling her adopted son, but the truth was infinitely more disturbing. In October 2019, 2 Venmo payments were made from Tylee's account to her older half-brother, Colby Ryan, with odd messages attached. When he expressed concern towards Tylee via text, he received responses from her cell phone indicating that she was safe, but too busy to talk. Melanie Gibb later said that Lori and Chad were convinced Tylee and JJ were possessed and had become zombies. Zolima Pastenes also testified that Chad had told his followers how, shortly before the little boy's disappearance, young JJ would soon die. But JJ's death was not the only one Chad predicted around this time. He began telling his followers that his wife, Tammy, was in limbo after becoming possessed by a spirit named Viola. Her case was a severe one. If they didn't act soon, she was in danger of becoming a zombie, and that was something which Chad was never going to allow. Right around the same time Colby Ryan was receiving Venmo payments from his dead sister, Tammy Daybell returned home from an errand, parked in her driveway, and stepped out of her car. A masked man stepped out from the shadows, aimed an assault rifle at her, then pulled the trigger. Tammy screamed, but her shriek of terror was the only sound to pierce the evening silence. The rifle had misfired. Tammy later told police that due to his mask, she had been unable to identify the man who attempted to shoot her. Police warned her to be much more vigilant and to report any further developments. But it was no good. 10 days later, Tammy was found dead in her home, apparently from natural causes. Chad claimed that she had retired the previous night with what he called a terrible cough, and that she tragically died in her sleep. He also mentioned that Tammy had been experiencing low blood pressure, seizures, and negative reactions with homeopathic medicines, though none of her medical records supported his claims. 3 days later, at Tammy's funeral, mourners found Chad's behavior extremely suspicious. The funeral came so soon, but it still felt so planned, one said. Others said Chad seemed businesslike, and that he didn't seem upset, and that he wasn't crying but was trying to cry. Mourners were then deeply perturbed when Chad referred to his late wife as lazy and not easy to live with during what was supposed to be a heartfelt eulogy. Chad's sister-in-law, Heather Daybell, thought his behavior verged on the bizarre and later stated that he just didn't seem upset. In the weeks that followed, Chad began introducing Lori to his friends and family. One of his neighbors, Alice Gilbert, described her first meeting with Lori as awkward, as despite the fact Chad had only recently buried his wife of 3 decades, he seemed remarkably happy. Gilbert observed that the couple was very affectionate, laughing and joking with one another, even as Lori explained how her daughter had passed away just 6 months prior. This marked the first admission that Tylee was deceased, but since Alice Gilbert was just a neighbor, she had no inkling whatsoever of the admission's sinister implications. Despite the cryptic hints at their terrible crimes, Chad and Lori played the role of a happy, wholesome Mormon couple who had bonded over personal tragedy. But by late November, their masks were beginning to slip. On November 26th of 2019, police visited Lori's Rexburg townhouse at the request of Kay Vallow, sister of the recently deceased Charles Vallow. She hadn't heard from little JJ for weeks and was beginning to grow concerned, and so on the afternoon of the 26th, 2 Rexburg police officers stopped by Lori's home. There, they found Chad Daybell and Alex Cox, who informed them that while Lori wasn't home, they were more than happy to answer any questions the officers might have. When asked where JJ was, Alex Cox claimed that he was with his paternal grandmother, Kay Vallow, the same woman who had called in the welfare check to begin with. Officers knew that he was lying, but played along before asking Chad where Lori was. Chad replied that he, quote, hardly knew Lori and was only present at her home because he was a friend of Alex. Again, that was demonstrably false. Marriage licenses are a matter of public record, and seeing as Chad and Lori had gotten hitched in Hawaii just weeks prior, the cops knew that he was lying too. When they eventually got in touch with Lori, she too provided the police with easily disprovable information. She claimed JJ was staying with Melanie Gibb in Arizona. One phone call was all it took to prove this was a lie. Chad and Lori might have made grave mistakes in lying to the police, but they weren't entirely moronic. They knew the game was up, and just hours after police came to question them, they loaded up a truck with their belongings and fled to Hawaii. Right around the same time Chad and Lori were moving into a rental home on the island of Kauai, police officers were conducting thorough searches of their homes. Days later, the Rexburg Police Department officially pronounced JJ and Tylee as missing persons and asked for the public's assistance in locating them. Police also announced that Chad and Lori were persons of interest following their prompt departure from the mainland United States, and that the children's disappearance might well be linked to the suspicious death of Chad's late wife, Tammy. As interest in the case grew, so did the amount of media attention it received, and before long, news networks all over the country were broadcasting interviews with people who described the errant couple's beliefs as frightening, disturbed, and cult-like. Incredibly, Chad and Lori released a statement through their attorney on December 23rd of 2019. An extract from the statement reads as follows: Chad Daybell was a loving husband, and he has the support of his children in this matter, while Lori is a devoted mother who resents assertions to the contrary. All false allegations will be addressed once we have moved beyond speculation and rumor. Their statement was met with a response in early 2020 when a collection of the couple's relatives issued a public message begging Lori and Chad return the children. They announced a reward of $20,000 being offered to anyone who either returned the missing children or shared information directly contributing to their return. Weeks later, on January 25th of 2020, Lori and Chad were located in Kauai and were handed a court order requiring Lori to physically produce Tylee and JJ at the Idaho Department of Welfare within the next 5 days. The next day, police seized the couple's rental car and searched their rental townhome in Princeville. Both Tylee's debit card and JJ's iPad were recovered. Just hours after their Princeville home was searched, the Daybells were confronted by an East Idaho news reporter named Nate Eaton. Eaton asked them where the children were. Chad and Lori refused to answer. Finally, on February 20th of 2020, Lori was arrested by the Kauai Police Department before being extradited to Idaho. Her arrest prompted Chad to also return to Idaho, where he tried convincing his neighbor, Alice Gilbert, to put her home up for bond to get Lori out of prison. When she asked why, he told her Jesus had given him the idea. When Alice then confronted him on what he had said about Lori's daughter being dead, Chad gave a cagey answer about it being a custody issue and then promptly fled the scene. Months went by without development until finally, in June of 2020, police found human remains buried in unmarked graves in the backyard of Chad's home. The bodies were located in an area the Daybell's family called the Pet Cemetery, as it had been used to bury their cats and dogs. As the property was being searched, Chad phoned Lori in jail to warn her about the situation. Then, after police found and began to unearth the bodies, he tried to flee the scene. He was chased down, apprehended, and then placed under arrest for concealment of evidence. Days after the discovery of the so-called Pet Cemetery, police confirmed the human remains found on Chad's property belonged to the missing children, Tylee and JJ. Tylee's body had been burned, and her hands had been cut off, while little JJ's body was relatively undamaged, having been wrapped in plastic before being gently lowered into the makeshift grave. However, unlike JJ, Tylee's remains had not been treated with such reverence. Her corpse was so decomposed and damaged that her cause of death could not officially be determined, while JJ's had been carefully dispatched with a plastic bag over his head and duct tape over his mouth, possibly after being drugged. Following the announcement that the children's bodies had been found, Chad Daybell was officially excommunicated by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints on the basis of his religious teachings, some of which were described as those of a Doomsday cult. At the trials, Lori was found guilty of the murder of her children. She received 3 consecutive life sentences for the murders and conspiracy, with an additional 2 life sentences and a 10-year term for grand theft to be served concurrently. She now resides at the Women's Correctional Center in Pocatello, Idaho. Chad's convictions came the following year when he was pronounced guilty on all counts, including murder, conspiracy, and insurance fraud. He was sentenced to death in June of 2024 and is currently being held at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution in Boise. If he's a man of conviction, and believes he'll be reincarnated on another plane of existence, facing the lethal injection shouldn't be too frightening for old 31 Lives Chad. But if those convictions waver, if his beliefs were merely a tool with which he could manipulate and murder without feeling an ounce of guilt, then it'll be a morbid comfort to know he faced the same mortal terror as those his victims did in their own final moments on Earth.